The ancient forests of Britain grew up some 8,000 years ago after the Ice Age. Since then, many birds have moved in to feed on the vast quantities of nuts, insects and fruit available in the trees. Many of these birds are hole nesters, but few of them are totally at home in this environment. For instance, none of these birds can actually dig out insects from under thick bark or excavate their own nest chambers. The holes are the work of the supreme forest specialist, the great spotted woodpecker. It's a master carpenter when it comes to digging out a nest hole or hunting for burrowing insects. The males even use the trees to hammer out their territorial boundaries to warn rivals elsewhere in the woodland. No other bird can beat its head against a tree with such force. These are the true headbangers of the forest. Throughout the world, there are some 200 species of woodpecker, of which 3 live in the woodlands of Britain. The green woodpecker is the largest of the trio and is found feeding in fields as well as among trees. The lesser spotted woodpecker is the smallest and least noticed species, being not much bigger than a sparrow. The most familiar, the great spotted, is well equipped with stiff tail feathers to support itself, strong claws to grip tree trunks, and a sharp beak used as a powerful digging tool, as well as for communication. Each individual woodpecker has its own recognizable drumming pattern to declare ownership of its territory. The exposed heartwood of a fallen tree makes a perfect drumming post. The action from above reveals the stump to be hollow and so ideal as a knocking post because it resonates the sound. Between drumming, the male woodpecker listens out for neighboring males replying to get an overall picture of who has which territory. He may drum in this way 500 or 600 times a day. That's nearly 10,000 blows. Even at a third of the natural speed, the hammering is too fast to see. Only by watching the bird 20 times more slowly than normal speed can we see the action clearly. This shows that the woodpecker's beak hits the tree around 18 times a second. But how does the woodpecker's head withstand such a beating? Why doesn't it knock itself out? The bird's head is cleverly designed to absorb the pounding. The muscles and bones of the lower jaw keep the woodpecker's beak in a straight line as it hits the tree. A pad of cartilage between the beak and the skull acts like a car shock absorber, cushioning the impact of each blow. The woodpecker also has a remarkably long tongue which extends around the brain case like a protective sling. And finally, because there's hardly any cavity beneath the skull, the brain cannot bounce around inside the bird's head. Without these adaptations, the woodpecker would probably fall unconscious after the first few blows. With the approach of spring, woodpeckers become very active in preparation for nesting. The male, distinguished by the red patch on the back of his head, is primarily responsible for nest building. It takes him several days, chipping away for 5 hours each day, to excavate a hole about 30 centimeters or so in depth. Even hard, living wood is chiseled away with little effort and with all the skill of a master carpenter. Some of the chippings will be left behind in the base of the cavity, but most are ejected. In late spring, the females will soon be ready to lay. Just above the woodpecker's nest is the hole he dug out last year. Woodpeckers rarely nest in the same hole twice, although they may use old chambers for roosting. Once the hollow is completed, the female will lay half a dozen or so pure white eggs on a layer of chippings. The nest isn't lined with feathers or leaves. In just 10 or 12 days, the eggs hatch and the young sit crouched in the bottom of the cavity, waiting for their parents to arrive with food. The male woodpecker seems to do most of the work, returning every few minutes with a beak full of soft-bodied insects. The hatchlings respond to the adults arriving at the tree and cutting the amount of light entering the chamber. A few minutes later, and he's back again with more food. The hungriest chick makes the most noise and gets fed. As the chicks become satisfied, they make less noise. So each chick usually ends up with its fair share. At 4 days old, the chicks are still blind, but have a swelling either side of the bill. It's very sensitive, and the chicks respond when the parents touch it. The buds of the wing feathers are just beginning to break through, and the red and black markings on the head are already visible. An important part of the woodpecker chick's diet are tortrix caterpillars that feed on oak leaves. The adult birds collect huge numbers of these moth larvae and so help control this serious pest. The caterpillars are so numerous that they can almost completely defoliate a tree in a few weeks. Presented with this abundant food supply, the chicks grow rapidly, and at 10 days old, they're looking much more like their parents. Space is limited in the nest, and now the parents feed their offspring from the entrance hole. But it will be at least another week before the chicks will emerge into the outside world. On the edge of the wood, a pair of green woodpeckers are busy feeding their own family. They feed mainly on ants and small insects that they find in crevices and under the bark of trees. Unlike the great spotted woodpecker, which delivers food to its young in its beak, the green woodpecker regurgitates food for its chicks. Like other woodpeckers, the female uses her strong claws to cling onto the tree and supports herself on her stiff tail feathers. The chicks can hear the adult calling as it arrives with food and begin their begging call in response. The green woodpecker, at about 30 centimeters long, is the largest of our three species. It normally lays only 3 or 4 eggs. The young often come to the mouth of the nest to be fed. On leaving the nest, the young woodpeckers spend much time on the ground, where they'll continue to be fed by their parents for a week or two. Many species of woodland bird take over old woodpecker holes once they've been abandoned by their owners. The great tit can rear up to 8 chicks in the safety of the chamber that it lines with soft material. It too synchronizes its breeding cycle with the abundance of the tortrix caterpillars. Some holes are occupied by starlings. These chicks are obviously waiting for their next meal. Starlings are messy birds, and the streaks of bird droppings on the outside of the hole is often a good indication that they've taken over a nest. For the nuthatch, the entrance to an old woodpecker hole is far too large, and it uses mud to reduce the size of the opening. A pair of nuthatches may return to the same hole year after year, and even though there's no need to mud up the entrance, they go through a ritualized mud-daubing routine. Meanwhile, the family of great spotted woodpeckers are still occupying their nest hole. The chicks' feathers are well developed, and they're outgrowing their quarters rapidly. As juveniles, they'll keep the red crown for several months. At this stage, the chicks start to venture more and more towards the mouth of the nest chamber, where their parents arrive to feed them. The chicks are now 16 days old and will soon be leaving the nest. The parents often tempt them out of the chamber with beakfuls of insects. 18 days after hatching, and 2 of the 5 chicks have already left. The third is about to follow. The female waits with a beak full of insects. The chick plunges into its first flight, 15 meters above the ground. After a week or so of being fed among the branches by its parents, the young woodpecker will have to learn to look for its own food among the trees. Seeds, nuts and insects abound in the forest, and the woodpecker is perfectly adapted to find and deal with all of them. In order to crack this particular nut, the woodpecker needs to support it in the cleft of a rotting log. Once the nut is wedged tight, the bird can then begin to pound away with its powerful beak. The great spotted woodpecker may have several such anvils within its territory that it uses regularly. Once the tough outer shell is cracked open, the bird can reach inside with its long tongue and remove the softer material. The woodpeckers may often turn to man-made anvils. This telegraph pole has been used for years. The woodpecker usually leaves its last pine cone still wedged in the pole. As it arrives with a fresh one, it ejects the old one. The tough green cone is chipped away to reach the small, developing seeds inside. This behavior is entirely instinctive. The young woodpecker has never seen its parents do this, although it may be stimulated by an eaten cone left in the pole by another bird. Woodpeckers have been using this particular telegraph pole for many years. The pile of half-eaten pine cones on the ground below is over a meter deep. But it's the woodpecker's skill at digging out wood-boring insects for which it is best known, and which has earned the bird its name. The great spotted woodpecker's tongue is about 5 centimeters long and is not only armed with tiny barbs at the tip, but is also covered with a sticky mucus. The bird taps at the trunk to detect tunnels and cavities beneath the surface, and then it chips away at the wood. Beetles, their larvae and pupae, are located and winkled out from their burrows. Many of the insects found in this way are very small indeed, and the woodpecker must dig out dozens each day to sustain itself, along with the nuts and other insects it comes across. They've been known to use the same techniques and skill to reach eggs and nestling birds in hollow tree trunks. One was even known to break into a concrete nest box to reach the chicks inside. But the majority of the woodpecker's prey is much smaller. Many of the wood-boring insects spend many years as larvae and then pupae before emerging as adult beetles to fly off and lay their eggs on other trees, unless the woodpecker gets to them first. The ability of the woodpecker to penetrate under the bark into the wood of trees ensures that it has a plentiful food source throughout the year. In winter, most insectivorous birds migrate south to warmer, more plentiful climes, but the woodpecker can vary its diet with the season and so remains to feed on cones, seeds, and buried insects. Fresh wood chippings on top of the snow is a sure sign that a woodpecker is at work. Many rotten trees, soft with age and riddled with insects, are hacked away right down to the heartwood. In winter, woodpeckers have even been known to strip bark off trees infested with fungi. But since excavation of wood is restricted only to rotting or dead trees, woodpeckers do no harm to the woodland. Where food is sufficient, woodpeckers will range only a few kilometers from their roost to feed during the harsh winter days. As the days lengthen, the woodland floor blooms with the vivid colors of spring. High in the trees above, the woodpeckers once more begin to drum out their unique rhythms as the new breeding season approaches. The success of the great spotted woodpecker is based on its unique ability to exploit trees. The bird's unusually adapted head enables it not only to drill into the wood for food and shelter, but also to hammer out its territorial signal and lay claim to its woodland home.
Wild Britain next Sunday at 7:30 follows a year in the life of a polecat and her 7 offspring.